Okay, paper 2 RS is coming up, so let's go through some last minute tips. So when you get in the exam, you'll notice that the question booklet contains questions on 6 different themes, A, B, C, D, E and F. You only answer questions on the 4 themes that you have studied. So in our case, that is theme A, relationships and families, theme B, religion and life, theme D, religion, peace and conflict, and theme E, religion, crime and punishment. So you need to aim for the same timings as you did for paper 1 because the total time for the paper is the same at 1 hour 45 minutes. So that means you should aim to spend about 27 minutes on each theme with about half the time for each section on the 12 marker. So themes for markers will invariably look like this. So it will say, explain 2 different beliefs in contemporary British society about something. Then underneath it will say, in your answer, you should refer to the main religious tradition of Great Britain and 1 or more other religious traditions. And that's the part that often pupils miss out. Remember that both of the beliefs that you explain in your answer need to be religious beliefs, and one of them must be a Christian belief because Christianity is the main religious tradition in Great Britain. So even if it doesn't say in the top bit of the question, explain 2 different religious beliefs, always aim to do that, to be on the safe side. So here's an example of what the answer would look like. So explain 2 different beliefs in contemporary British society about breaking the law to get a bad law changed, which is quite a hard question. In your answer, you should refer to the main religious tradition of Great Britain and 1 or more other religious traditions. So here in this model answer, there are 2 different Christian perspectives. So many Christians feel it's always important to keep the law in all situations. This is because otherwise it would be going against the Bible teaching that states, obey the laws of the land. And other Christians may feel it may be okay to break the law if it's morally bad and against Jesus' teaching to love one another. Example of this would be when Corrie ten Boom broke the law to protect the Jews. So notice here there's point development in both sections of the answer. And in both cases, it's clearly stated which religious belief is being given. So 6 markers, again, will invariably look like this. So explain 2 religious beliefs about something, and then again, the instruction underneath is really key. It says, refer to sacred writings or another source of religious belief and teaching in your answer. Now, remember that the way these 6 markers differ from the 4 markers is that, again, you're giving 2 different perspectives or 2 different beliefs or views, but one of them has to be supported with a named reference to sacred writing or another source of belief and teaching. And you have to highlight what the supporting evidence you choose to give shows to earn the 6th mark. So here we have a model answer for an animal experimentation question. So explain 2 religious beliefs about animal experimentation, refer to sacred writings or another source of religious belief and teaching in your answer. Notice the bit in purple because that's the link to sacred writing and then the explanation. So the answer reads as follows. Most Christians feel that animal experimentation for human medical purposes is acceptable. This is because they believe in the sanctity of human life. This is a belief that comes from the teaching in the Bible. Note that I've stated where the sacred writing I'm referencing comes from, which is really important. Where it states, God made humans in his image. This shows that animal experimentation could be justified to protect human life. So notice how I've clearly linked the sacred writing that I've given back to the focus in the question. And second point, Muslims usually believe that animal experimentation is wrong. This is because Islamic teachings emphasize that intentionally causing harm to an animal is always wrong or haram. So point development twice, and then one of the points has been developed, and then there's a link to sacred writing, and then there's the explanation of it too. So the 12 markers for themes be guided, again, like with paper 1, by the bullet points that are there, the points that are highlighted here. So there'll be the statement, it will ask you to evaluate the statement, and underneath it basically tells you what to do. So use this as a guide. So in all 12 markers, you need to give arguments, so more than one, in support of the statement. You should give reasoned arguments, again, plural, more than one, to support a different point of view. You need to make sure in those arguments that you have referred to religious arguments. You can also refer to non-religious arguments, but they're optional. That's why they're highlighted a different colour here. They're optional. So if you can't think of other religious arguments to give, either for or against, it's fine to link to some non-religious arguments. But please remember that you're taking a religious studies course, so you always need to give priority to the religious points of view. And lastly, we need to aim to always have that justified conclusion at the end. Okay, so I'm going to take you through now just some useful, hopefully useful teachings and pointers that will help you in your paper 2. So overall for paper 2, there are a couple of really key teachings that Jesus gave us which we can use. So Jesus taught a lot about what we call agape love. So he gave quite a few teachings that talk about loving people. So we've got love one another, love your neighbour, and love your enemies. So if we start with love one another and love your neighbour, these teachings can basically apply to sort of across all themes, and they'll help you to argue that a valid Christian response will always be to decide on what the most loving course of action is. So for example, if some Christians, who adopt this view, if they're thinking about should they accept same-sex parents, well then their opinion might be, well, what's the most loving thing to do? Probably to accept same-sex parents, right? It's the most loving thing to do, so they might accept it. If we're talking about abortion, some Christians might think, okay, what's the most loving thing to do? Jesus said love one another. In this particular situation where someone is considering having an abortion, what would be the most loving thing to do? And that might lead them to conclude that an abortion could be the most loving thing to do. For example, in case of rape, or if the mother's life is at risk, or if the fetus has like massive abnormalities, for example. Okay, so love one another and love your neighbour are really helpful. Jesus said those are really famous teachings of his. They sort of sum up all of his other teachings really, and they can be applied in most situations. Of course, Jesus also takes it a step further by talking about loving your neighbour, and of course he means by that anybody, but then he also teaches that loving an enemy is also really important. And again, this can also be applied to a wide range of topics, especially from themes D and E, because if you're going to love your enemy and try to put Jesus' teaching into practice, then that obviously has implications for war, for protest, for why religious people are against terrorist acts, and also, of course, for how people who've committed crimes should be treated. So top tips for theme A. We're going to work through the 4 themes now. So a useful contrast to remember on most issues in theme A is between the views of the Catholic Church and the Quakers. So the Catholic Church has very traditional views about sex outside of marriage, same-sex relationships, same-sex parents, divorce, contraception, and family life. And helpfully, all of these views can actually be found in the Catechism of the Catholic Church, so you can reference that as a source of authority. In contrast to the views of the Catholic Church, Quakers adopt a much more liberal view that's actually in many ways more consistent with the modern context and the views people generally have in Great Britain today, especially younger generations, about issues like marriage, divorce, sex, contraception, same-sex marriage, roles in the family, gender equality, etc. So on most issues relating to sex and relationships, the views of the Catholic Church are also consistent with Islamic views, so you can actually use one view and then back it up with the other. So for example, any sex outside of marriage, whether we're talking same sex or opposite sex, sex before marriage, sex during a marriage like cheating, is seen as adultery in the Catholic Church, and so it goes against the commandment from the 10 Commandments, you shall not commit adultery. Similarly, any sex outside of marriage in Islam is seen as zina, or unlawful sex, and the Quran teaches come not near to unlawful sex. And to be clear, zina includes, again, any sex outside of marriage, whether we're talking same-sex relationships or opposite-sex relationships. So in relation to family life and gender equality, please note that there is a lot of diversity across both Christianity and Islam. What happens is that students tend to reduce it down to quite stereotypical views, and we just need to be mindful of that. So some Christians see men and women as having equal roles in family life and in leading the church. But Catholic teachings emphasise that only men can be priests and lead in the church. Some Christian families do have very gender-specific roles, with the role of the woman being to take care of the family, to have the children, to do kind of the home life, and the role of the father being and to go out to work and provide. But many don't have that. Many Christian families don't have those very gender-specific roles, especially in the UK context, so just be mindful of that. Islamic teachings through Prophet Muhammad actually emphasise the special role that mothers play in the family. So one of Prophet Muhammad's hadith states, heaven sits at the feet of the mothers. But again, there is diversity because in some Islamic countries, the rights of women have been eroded, e.g. like in Afghanistan, and often that is based on a very narrow interpretation of certain texts in the Quran. So in both Christianity and Islam, parents generally would have responsibility for teaching children about the important beliefs and practices, essentially that we studied for paper 1. So the role of Christian parents would be to teach their children about the Trinity, to teach them about how to pray, like the Lord's Prayer, about the importance of charity, etc. And in Islam, the role of the parents is to teach wudu, teach how to pray, the importance of zakah, the importance of like fasting when the child is old enough. So you can link back to what you hopefully learnt about for paper 1 if you're writing about the role of parents. And children, of course, are responsible for sort of embracing that information, for listening to their parents, for learning, being receptive to learning about the beliefs and practices. And it's helpful also to remember that one of the 10 commandments in Christianity is actually that you should honour your father and mother. So let's move on now to theme B. So again, there's like a couple of key terms here that will really help you. So sanctity of life and quality of life. So we see sanctity of life really reflected in the teachings of the Catholic Church. It's totally against abortion and assisted dying, which are the two kind of really big topics in theme B. And they're against those practices based on sanctity of life. So the view that all human life is sacred and so should be absolutely protected from conception. And they would use the teaching from the creation story where it says that humans are made in the image of God to support that belief in sanctity of life. So other Christians argue that yes, sanctity of life is important, but that there sometimes needs to be a more flexible approach that takes into account the quality of life. So that means that they might be likely to be more open to abortion and assisted dying based on like the severity of the situation and whether it could be a loving action to allow abortion or assisted dying because of maybe a poor quality of life that somebody is either having or is likely to have in the case of abortion if they were to be born. So also within theme B, of course, we have these environment and animal life topics. So the key concepts within Christianity are stewardship and dominion, which sort of complement each other, but also in a way are subtly different. So stewardship is the idea that people should be taking care of the earth, that they should act as good stewards and protect the earth, to care for the environment and the animals. And evidence to back that up from the Bible comes from where it says the earth is the Lord's and everything in it, and also God created the heavens and the earth. But there is also the belief in dominion that comes strongly through, particularly the creation stories in the Bible, where it says that humans are told to rule over the birds of the air, the fish of the sea. And after the story of Noah's Ark, where God tells Noah and his family that everything that moves is now to be their food because they're basically like at the top of the food chain. So in Islam, there isn't really the idea of dominion. So stewardship is really clearly emphasized. It's actually viewed as haram in Islam to treat animals with cruelty and not protect the environment. And how people treat the environment is actually believed to be recorded in their book of deeds and will be taken into account on the day of judgment. Now let's move on to theme D. So there's a few key concepts here that the examiners will be really looking for you to make use of in your answers. So in Christianity, we have the just war theory. It was developed by St. Thomas Aquinas, which basically suggests that war can be justified in some situations, right? So it can be just or justified in self-defense to protect innocent people, for example. And there is some support from the Bible to back this view up. So in the Old Testament, it highlights that the Lord is a warrior, so suggesting that, even God might be prepared to fight in some situations. And it also states there is a time for war and a time for peace. However, there are some religious believers within the family of Christianity called Quakers, who we know about, who reject the idea of the just war theory. They would argue, they're pacifists, that war can never be justified. And they would use Jesus' teaching, blessed are the peacemakers, and also love your enemies, to back up their view. In Islam, we also have the concept of lesser jihad, and the idea again that war can be justified in some situations. So for example, if you're fighting in the cause of God, you're fighting to defend God, to defend Islam against people who are attacking you. But it's very clear in this teaching from the Quran here, fight in the cause of God, those who fight against you but do not transgress limits, that there are limits on the amount of violence that can be used. So again, you can use violence to protect yourself, but you can't be the aggressor, and you need to not use excessive force. So when it comes to weapons of mass destruction, which are kind of another big topic within theme D, they obviously connect back to what we've just been mentioning. So the Christian just war theory highlights that you shouldn't use excessive force and target civilians. So the use of weapons of mass destruction like nuclear weapons would go against that. And also the Islamic rules for lesser jihad emphasize that excessive force shouldn't be used either. Of course, stewardship of the environment would mean that weapons of mass destruction would also be seen as wrong for both Christians and Muslims. And of course, weapons of mass destruction, they cause a massive loss of life, so they go against sanctity of life too. So when we talk about using weapons of mass destruction, I think it's important to also make a distinction here. So there's the using them, detonating them, exploding them, if you like. But there's also the option where countries like our own have weapons of mass destruction, but we keep them for deterrence. And so there are some Christians who would argue that when countries have weapons of mass destruction, that can be justified, and that over the period of the past 70 years or so, the fact that countries have had these weapons has actually prevented World War III from starting. So it's almost seen as a way of putting Jesus' teaching, blessed are the peacemakers, almost into practice. Although obviously Quakers would totally disagree with that. And lastly, we have theme E, the crime and punishment theme. So let's just have a quick look at what the Christian ideas mainly are. So when it comes to this theme, there's a lot of emphasis in Christianity typically on reformation. So trying to reform people who've committed crime, whether that be through community service or prison. And a lot of that comes back to Jesus' teaching about forgiveness. Remember in the Lord's Prayer, he taught, forgive us our trespasses as we forgive those who trespass against us. And he also taught in the parable of the sheep and the goats, I was sick and in prison and you visited me, highlighting the importance of caring for people in prison and the fact that how we treat prisoners is going to be taken into account. There are, however, some Christians who support retribution as the primary aim of punishment, and they would use Old Testament teaching such as an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth to back up their view, and this actually leads some Christians to strongly support the use of the death penalty. The Bible also emphasises the importance of following the law, so the writings of St. Paul emphasise obey the laws of the land. So Christians typically believe that punishments such as prison and community service are necessary for people who don't obey the law, right? There needs to be some consequences for not doing so. Christianity is, however, strongly against the use of physical punishment known as corporal punishment. Islamic teachings typically emphasize that crimes should be punished consistently to ensure justice. So there's not really much taking into account of the factors or the causes of crime within Islamic law. So this is often linked to retribution and deterrence as two aims of punishment. So Islamic teachings show that punishments such as prison and community service are necessary for people who don't obey the law. And actually punishments for some serious crimes are listed in the Quran. So in terms of corporal punishment, it says, cut off the hands of thieves, whether they be man or woman, as punishment for what they have done, a deterrent from God, and life for a life, an eye for an eye, a nose for a nose. So these teachings, which both come from the scripture of which there is no doubt, show why some Muslim countries still use corporal punishment and the death penalty, where they're basing the laws of the country on Sharia law or laws that are extracted from the Quran. Lastly, try and remember the difference between the sort of list of things in this theme. So we have corporal punishment and capital punishment. We need to not get the two confused. So corporal punishment is violent punishment, such as the removal of the hand we've just seen. Capital punishment is another term for the death penalty. And of course, that is supported by teaching in both the Bible and the Quran. Also remember the difference between the three aims of punishment. So retribution, which is the direct payback for crime, linked to the whole idea of an eye for an eye, which we see in both Islam and Christianity. Deterrence, which is the aim of using punishment to put people off committing more crime in the future. And reformation, where the primary aim is to reform criminals, even if they're never going to get out of prison, okay, and to try and help them to become better people. And this is a way of linking to Jesus' teaching, love your neighbour. Lastly, I just want to quickly mention hate crime, which is basically a criminal offence caused by hostility or prejudice based on a person's disability, race, religion, or sexual orientation. So hate crime, that can be an act of theft, it can be an act of vandalism, it can be an act of physical assault, it could even be a murder. But a hate crime is defined as such when the crime itself has been caused by a prejudice, like a hatred of a particular group. And obviously, both Christianity and Islam would be totally opposed to any kind of hate crime.